Hello, BookTube. A couple of months ago, Micah Cummins and I did a buddy read, spur of the moment thing that we really enjoyed. And it was a forward facing buddy read, so we gave reports on it to you and made videos about it and invited you to join along. A lot of you enjoyed it as well. So we decided we would do that again and once again enjoyed ourselves. And so for April, we are doing a buddy read. And we made announcement videos. We're doing a buddy read of Beowulf. And the morning after we made our announcement videos, each of us encountered a severed orc's head in our bed. And on a totally unrelated note, we happily welcomed David Wiley to this read-along for Beowulf, which is one of his favorite works of literature. And we decided for April, since the work is so short, I mean, it's 100 pages soaking wet, so it's not anything that you could rack out over a whole month. We decided instead that it would be fun if we did multiple translations of this work. Just to compare and contrast them, see what they're like. That would be a lot of fun. It's one of my favorite things to do. We started out with J.R. Tolkien's translation, which he did basically privately. It's only thanks to the industry of his son, Christopher Tolkien, that we have the volume that we were all using last week, which has Tolkien's translation and also tons and tons of notes and lectures and essays and whatnot that he did about Beowulf and about Anglo-Saxon literature. And this week we're doing the opposite. This week we're going from a work that was essentially never polished for publication to Michael Alexander's translation for Penguin Classics, which was not only done for publication, but was done for widespread publication. Penguin Classics went into every university, they went into every school. A whole generation of readers encountered this book this way. Which has a long introduction by Michael Alexander, and then the poem itself, and then tons of notes. And I tried my hardest to go into the translation with an open mind, especially the second time, despite that introduction, where Michael Alexander made me hate him, which is never an easy thing to overcome when you're talking about reading something with an open mind. But at one point in his introduction, Michael Alexander makes mention of J.R.R. Tolkien. There's no way that you can't do that. Tolkien wrote one of the most famous, most reprinted, and most influential essays about Beowulf that's anyone's ever written. And there's been no shortage of writing about this book. So Alexander can't help but mention Tolkien. And when he does, he describes Tolkien as the author of the children's book, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. At which point, reading it even the second time, I uttered a South Boston expletive out loud. Because you know as well as I do, Michael Alexander knew when he wrote that as well as anybody. He knew as well as the sun coming up in the morning that The Lord of the Rings is not a children's book. He was parading his condescension. And a scholar who is doing a translation of an ancient work, who is comfortable parading his condescension, I intuited at the time and believe still, will also be comfortable parading his pretension, his pretentiousness. And we will see if that's the case with this book. Of course, with a Penguin Classic, you're going to get the Penguin critical apparatus. So you're going to get an introduction, no matter how insufferable it is. It's still going to be by a recognized expert, usually. And you're going to get extensive notes in a way that the information would be there in the Tolkien version, but here it's much more clearly presented for students or newcomers to the work, whoever they are. I've never really, I think there's a doctoral dissertation to be written about what kind of thing an introduction to a Penguin Classic actually is. This would be a perfect, there are a number of examples that I can come up with. What is it supposed to be? It's almost never what it's actually called. It's almost never actually an introduction to the work. Usually it's the airing of all sorts of ideological laundry. But it will provide you with a whole bunch of facts about the work that you are about to read. So those of you who couldn't get your hands on the Tolkien translation, that volume by Christopher Tolkien, will certainly be able to get a copy of this. I mean, they're everywhere. You could get this, I'm sure, for $1 on eBay. This has been reprinted and revised 1,000,000 times. And it's in this book that we are once again treated to the unbelievable story of this book itself. Not the story of Beowulf, the Geatish superhero who fights monsters. Not that story. That story, that is, of course, the story of the poem here. Beowulf goes to King Hrothgar, to his besieged hall of Heorot, in order to fight and kill the monster Grendel, who has been preying on Hrothgar's men. That naturally ticks off Grendel's mother, and so Beowulf has to fight and kill her too. and then we get a long period that is not really in the book, where Beowulf goes back home to Geatland and becomes its king and rules it justly and equitably and peacefully for 50 years. But then he has to go out the way he came in, so he fights a dragon. And although he kills the dragon also manages to kill him too. We don't get anything else. Really, not much else. There's a whole bunch of history of the region that is mentioned or alluded to or glanced at by the Beowulf poet, but we don't get, for instance, anything about Beowulf's youth. We're told that he has the strength of 30 men. That's enormous. That's a lot. That's that concentrated in one person. That's enough to uproot a tree. Did Beowulf fight monsters in Geatland as a young man, as a teenager? Did he know? I mean, he had to have known that it was a good idea, a good even bet for him to go over the sea and advertise his services fighting and killing a monster. He never seems in any doubt that he's going to win against Grendel. That bespeaks experience to me, but we never get anything like that. And that is the story of the poem, but the story of the manuscript is every bit as fascinating. I mentioned last week, we only have one manuscript of Beowulf, just one. I think it's in the British Museum. It dates from around AD 1000, with the AD standing for Anno Domini, which is translated as the year of our Lord, with our Lord being Jesus Christ. Since I have to specify that, since otherwise it's going to be called something stupid and fascistically anodyne like Common Era. What makes it Common Era? Any particular thing? Anyway, this is not going to be a rant about academia. Instead, this is going to be a story about this manuscript, which is amazing. We don't know its full history. In 1563, this was in the possession of Lawrence Noel, who was the Dean of Lichfield, and who was a student, for all we know, the first student of Old English. What he did with it, we have no idea. Did he look at it? Did he keep it in a case? Was it sitting on a table? Did people copy it? Did his students copy it? Did anybody think to do that? We don't know. We have no idea. And we don't know. I mean, its fate just disappears from history for huge chunks of time, where you want to know where this manuscript is. Of course, this whole idea of tracing a manuscript and the incredibly perilous journey that one single copy makes gets even more exaggerated when we're talking about much older things, like, for instance, the poems of Catullus. But eventually, in a century later, this is in the possession of Sir Robert Cotton. This one manuscript is in his possession. He dies in 1631. And after his death, there's a fire in his home, which was stacked to the rafters with books and old manuscripts. Who knows how many old manuscripts he had? Did he think that the Beowulf manuscript was anything special? We don't know. And if he didn't think it was anything special, was he justified? He might have been. Who knows what he had that was more special? But there was a fire. And this manuscript was burned. If you go and look at it, it's burned. We don't know how much of it was lost to the fire. We know it's a damaged manuscript. We have no idea what it looked like when Lawrence Noel had it, much less when Sir Robert Cotton had it. When he originally came into its possession, did he buy it? Did it mean something to him? We have no idea. None whatsoever. It almost was destroyed. It wasn't in another room or in a safe box in the basement. The fire was raging in the room. The fire burned the manuscript, part of it. We came that close to not knowing anything about this, to not knowing that this existed at all. Think of how integral this is to Western culture. Once the Victorians got their hands on this thing, it was talked about, written about, and translated endlessly, and it has been translated ever since. Hence this whole Buddy Read event, which is built around a tiny, tiny fraction of the translations that are out there. We would not have any of that this thing was absolutely fundamental to all the authors who gave rise to the whole genre of epic fantasy. They wouldn't have had this to give rise to that genre. They wouldn't have known anything about it. The one and only copy. Unless the Dean of Lichfield had young people copying this thing, and those copies are out there somewhere. None have ever come to light. No other version of this that predates, for instance, there was a guy named Thorcon who made copies in the late 18th century. Industriously made a couple of copies. And before him, we don't know that anybody made copies of this thing. I can't believe that wouldn't happen. I know that writing utensils and writing equipment and paper and whatnot was expensive and rare, but the Dean of Lichfield would have had them. I find it hard to believe in the 1560s that he didn't have copies made of this thing. They've never come to light, and who knows how different they would be. Do those copies follow Beowulf back to Geatland? Do they describe adventures of his when he gets back home? I have no idea. Was it 5 times as long? We have no idea. We have no idea. We almost lost it completely. It almost disappeared completely from history. But it came to us, and it has, I believe, almost single-handedly created the whole idea of the epic fantasy. And I had that all in mind when I was revisiting the Michael Alexander translation, because when you get to the Penguin translation, it's radically different from the Tolkien translation, naturally. And not just because the Tolkien translation that we were reading wasn't a finished thing, but also because every translator has 2 paths diverging in front of them. We've talked about this many times about translation, and they have to make a choice. And you have to. If you're going to translate something that is alien, you have to make a choice. Are you going to convey the exact, as close as you can to a faithful word-by-word rendition of the original? Or are you going to try to convey its spirit, the reason why we love it? A seeding, usually unspoken, but sometimes translators will come right out and say it, that the actual word-for-word thing can't be done. Which of those 2 paths are you going to follow as a translator? Tolkien very much follows the second one. Anglo-Saxon fan that he was, linguist that he was first and foremost a writer, and he follows the second path. He decides to try to convey the spirit, the world, the echo, the sense, the wonder of Beowulf. Michael Alexander tries the other way. To the extent that it's possible, he tries the other way. Beowulf as a poem would have been, even if you were able to, magically imbibe the Anglian dialect or whatever, the language that it was originally sung in, as your modern sensibilities would find the way it was sung incredibly strange. Just incredibly strange. There is a very pronounced, very much governing rhythm to Beowulf, and to a lot of Anglo-Saxon poetry, a very governing rhythm. The rhythm is a lot of the point. And we don't really think about that anymore these days. We certainly don't think in that way. So if you were to listen to the way this was originally performed, with da 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 da. That would just, I feel certain that a modern reader, a modern person listening to that performance, the way it was performed would completely distract you from what was being said. And maybe that was the draw. We don't know. We have no idea what audiences actually listened to this for. It's possible that they thought the story was beside the point, or largely beside the point. It's an alien world, and you've got an uphill battle as a translator if you try to convey it in English. And Michael Alexander, bless his condescending, pretentious heart, does try to do that, at least a little. So I was thinking about that when I took up this old Penguin classic, and oh, look at that. Oh, it fell apart. Oh, I see. We didn't need a fire in the Dean of Lichfield's residence. We didn't need a fire in Sir Robert Cotton's residence. The glue that Penguin used to make this 60 years ago dried up. And the glue was the only thing holding the paper of the cover to the text block. Oh, okay. Well, fortunately, we're not out of luck because it is 2023, and I have this slate of plastic and glass. So let's consult this slate of plastic and glass and see if we can find Beowulf. I'm pretty sure that we can. Let's see. Oh, look at that. There it is. And it is indestructible. It's an electronic file, so it's indestructible. Just sits there on this machine. And if this machine loses power, you can always just plug it in to a power source and revive it. And this is the verse translation of Beowulf by Michael Alexander. And I want to give you a sense of what he's doing here. And to do that, I will go to my bookmarks. Only they won't be fumbling out of the book. Where's my book? They won't be dog ears either. They're electronic bookmarks. I can just access them easily at a touch. But anyway, I want to read you a passage from here about the coming of Grendel to Heorot. With the coming of night came Grendel also, sought the great house, and how the Ring-Danes held their hall when the horn had gone round. He found in Heorot the force of nobles, slept after supper, sorrow forgotten, the condition of men, maddening with rage, he struck quickly, creature of evil. Grim and greedy, he grasped on their palates, thirsty warriors, and away he was out of there. Thrilled with his catch, he carried off homeward. His glut of slaughter sought his own halls. As the day broke, with dawn's light, Grendel's outrage was openly to be seen. Night's table laughter turned to morning's lamentation. Lord Hrothgar sat silent then, the strong man mourned. Glorious king, he grieved for his thanes, as they read the traces of a terrible foe, a cursed fiend. That was too cruel a feud, too long, too hard. Nor did he let them rest, but the next night brought new horrors, did more murder, manslaughter, and outrage, and shrank not from it. He was too set on these things. Your listening ear is automatically going to think that Hrothgar has turned to mass murder, but no, that he shifts from Hrothgar to Grendel without signaling that. But you can see what Michael Alexander is trying to do here. And I think we can agree that it fails. It is probably very much closer to the sound and the reading. I don't know how much the original people who heard Beowulf read it. I bet they didn't read it at all, but I'd be willing to bet that manuscript that the Dean of Lichfield has would have been unrecognizable to the men who originally heard this poem performed. We don't know that, and we probably never will know that. But whether or not this is closer to what they heard, it's completely alien to what we want, to what our reading mind expects. So you're reading this and you're bumping along like a sack of beans in the back of a wagon. You know what Michael Alexander is going for. And this is a more complete translation. Tolkien leaves out chunks of Beowulf just because the thing that we were reading from him last week was not a finished product. If Tolkien had been given a sackload of dragon gold and told, make an edition of Beowulf for publication, maybe even in Penguin Classics, you can bet he was a perfectionist. You can bet that it would have been far more elaborate than the version that we read last week. But even if it had been as elaborate as could be, it wouldn't have sounded anything like this. This is an academic trying to convey what the poem is actually like, as opposed to the reason why the poem would have been popular. Those are the choices that a translator has to make. Sometimes, if you get a brilliant translator, those choices can be melded effectively. I don't know. I'm sure that Michael Alexander is a very good translator, but he's not a very good English poet. And that's kind of what you need to be if you're rendering a thing into English verse. You can't just say, well, it loses something in the translation, or you had to be there. You have to be producing something that's readable, and this goes on like that, with that kind of very jarring attempt to recreate the rhythm of the original. It goes on like that for the whole of Michael Alexander's version. Now, that version has a million notes. It has a long introduction that has that one maddening piece of condescension about The Lord of the Rings being a children's book, but it has a lot of other stuff too that you'll find interesting. So there's no way that I can not recommend the version, although paper books have their limitations. Very much so, they do. But there's no way that I can not recommend this, especially since it's going to take you half an hour to read. You could spend a very fruitful day studying the critical apparatus. That would take you longer. But that is the Michael Alexander translation here, which is, we have now seen a number of variations of the art of translation. Without planning it, I was assuming that if Micah and I read multiple translations of any work, multiple variations on the idea of translating would come up. For instance, was it private or was it intended for the public? If it was intended for the public, was it intended for a scholarly public? In addition to that, which of those two translator roads are you going to take? Are you going to convey the essence in the language of your time? Or are you going to try to convey the substance in the language of its time? Which of those two things are you going to do? I'm not saying that either one of those is preferable, but every translator has to decide that. Unless you get a translator who is so talented in the target language of a translation that translator can actually capture both. But in order to do that, the translator has to be a great artist on their own. And academics usually aren't. I mean, Tolkien was an exception, but and there are others. We're coming to a couple of others, but for now, that is our translation this time around. Fortunately, I had it on a completely imperishable tablet, which the Dean of Lichfield did not have. Sir Robert Cotton did not have a tablet in his home. Or he could have grabbed it and stuffed it in his pocket and brought all 1,000 of his books out into the light of day and just watched his house burn. Well, he was dead. But his family, I think stories like that are fascinating. We don't know anything about, barely anything about, how people thought about this one and only manuscript of a work that we consider indispensable. We barely have it at all. It came so close to being gone. So close that the fire was actually touching it. That is amazing to me. Just amazing. I guess maybe that makes me, a diehard bookworm, because I find that story every bit as fascinating as the story in the poem of Beowulf. But anyway, we're going to move on next week to another translation of Beowulf. We're going to move from the academic to the popular. Our last two translations of Beowulf will be popular translations that were very much done. They were done by extremely learned people, but they were very much done for public consumption. So next week we'll be reading the Burton Raffles translation of Beowulf, which made a dragon hoard of money on its own. It raked in the money and was everywhere, absolutely ubiquitous as a translation. Was it good? Well, whether it was good or not, how will it be different from the two that we've seen so far? I think that sort of thing is fascinating. So, well, I'll wrap this up for now, and we will join us all then next week when we read the Burton Raffles translation. We'll see what we make of it. And I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.